Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a twistingly tragic podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 161, Cahiers du CINÉMA Part 4, Claude Chabrol.
That's right, we're on 4 out of 5 today. We are on Claude Chabrol. And these last two folks we're talking about are probably two of the lesser known of the French New Wave directors, although maybe not rightfully so. And we'll get into why that is. But Claude Chabrol is a very interesting director who I haven't really watched any of his work before the preparation for this podcast.
Yeah, I think we were talking just off air about what a nice surprise Chabrol has been. He's really entertaining and really good at what he does, and yet nobody talks about him.
Nobody talks about him, and he's also a really, really good example. Yet again, just like all of the new wave directors have been, how even though they lump themselves together and other people lump themselves together into one French New Wave, what that means when it comes to each of them and their work and their outlook on film is very different. And even within the definition of French New Wave, there is a lot of variety and a lot of diversity of filmmaking there. So let's talk about one Claude Henri Jean Chabrol. I'm guessing that's how you pronounce all of it. Who was born June 24th, 1930. He was born in Paris, but he grew up in the small French town of Sardent, which may sound familiar if you watch the films for this week, because that's the same country town from Beau Serge, which is also...
Hearing Alex have like a guttural excrement every time he speaks French.
Oui, we are here to speak about the French New Wave. But that's also on location. They actually shot in that town too when he went to go shoot Les Beau Serge. And he grew up in a family of pharmacists, but rather than following in the footsteps of the family business, he caught the cinema bug. And as a young man and teenager in Sardent, he would even host a film club in one of the barns in the town. But after World War II, he moved to Paris as a student of pharmacology, where he fell in love with the cineclub culture in the Latin Quartier, meeting his future Cahiers comrades, which is a story we've told now 4 times, and it'll soon be a 5th. I
just want to say, starting a film club in a barn in a rural town just sounds like the most idealistic, Steven Spielberg 80s I love movies kind of a thing.
It's got a very big Spielberg or Rossellini type vibe to it, or Cinema Paradiso type vibe to it.
Yeah.
100%. He did graduate pharmacology school and served a mandatory military service in the medical corps of the French army. But he would spend most of his time while stationed in Germany as the film projectionist for his outpost. Post-army, he joined Cahiers as a writer, although he left the army legitimately, unlike Truffaut. And as a writer at Cahiers, in addition to championing realism and mise-en-scene and deep focus, Chabrol also spilt a lot of ink on genre films, especially detective stories, noirs, and thrillers. And he loved Hitchcock. A lot of these guys loved Hitchcock, but Chabrol really loved Hitchcock.
He has a great piece on Rear Window that is one of the pieces that's been translated into English in the French New Wave study materials on the blog, if you're interested.
Yeah. And this is a bit more nuanced, but a lot of Chabrol's writing in the journal was much more focused on film technique and talking about films he loved and techniques he loved. And
what does that show in his work?
Less aggressive in lambasting other filmmakers like Truffaut's was. Chabrol was the only Cahiers member who didn't make a short film before his feature debut. He just went straight to shooting his first feature. And he did co-write the book Hitchcock in 1957 with Eric Romer. And again, he was obsessed with the thrillers of Hitchcock, focusing mostly in his writing in the book on the early American works of Hitchcock, like Rebecca.
Not to be confused with the book Hitchcock by Francois Truffaut.
Yeah, they just kept naming it the same thing. It's so weird. But there actually is a pretty fun story about Chabrol and Truffaut, who, when they went to America during the shooting of To Catch a Thief, actually, I don't know if it was in America. I just know it was for the shooting of To Catch a Thief. And they first met Hitchcock.
That one could have easily been in Europe.
Yeah, right. When they first met Hitchcock, actually, when they first saw Hitchcock on set, they got so distracted and so starstruck that both Chabrol and Truffaut walked straight into a water tank. And Hitchcock would say years later that he still thought of them every time he saw ice cubes in a glass of whiskey, which I'm sure would delight Chabrol. Like, he would love that. In 1950,
that's the most filmmaker thing to say too. It's like the rocks in this whiskey remind me of the two men as they bobbed up and down in the water. Like, that's such a Hitchcockian way to think.
Oh yeah, 100%. In 1957, he used a portion of his wife's inheritance from her grandmother, I believe, to film his debut film and his debut feature, Les Beau Serge, on location in his hometown of Sardent. And this would be the movie that announced the arrival of the French New Wave. They all except for Chabrol, had been making short films before this, which had gotten some attention, but it wasn't until Chabrol made Les Beau Serge that the French New Wave was kind of announced on stage. And again, and we're kind of going to see this a few times today, but while we often think of as the first two big films of the French New Wave being Breathless and The 400 Blows, Les Beau Serge actually had more ticket sales compared to any other movie in the early French New Wave except for The 400 Blows. It was a very popular, very successful movie that was talked about a lot and kind of became the herald of the French New Wave. But when you read like your Wikipedia blurbs about the French New Wave, you might see it mentioned if you get into the nitty gritty, but you're probably just going to see The 400 Blows and Breathless, and you're going to hear Truffaut and Godard over and over. But Les Beaux met huge critical success, and much to Chabrol's delight, lots of comparison to Hitchcock, which it definitely has a lot of influence from Hitchcock in its creation, as well as other American thrillers and melodrama. But also during the production of that company, or the production of that film, Chabrol founded a company known as AJYM Productions. And if you've seen some early French New Wave films, you've probably seen their logo. The name is it's a combination of the initials of his wife and kids, all put together into one thing. But this is a very important production company, and this is a very important reason as to why Chabrol himself was so key to the early success of the French New Wave. Because after he founded AJYM, he was able to use the proceeds from Les Beaux Serge to help get other French New Wave directors up and running on their first feature films, including Romer, Rivette, and Truffaut. The 400 Blows was produced in part by AJYM. Paris Belongs to Us by Rivette was produced entirely, I think, by AJYM. And it wouldn't be around forever due to things that happened in Chabrol's career. But without AJYM and Chabrol's support, a good chunk of the Cahiers crew would not have been able to transition to feature film directing in the way they did. Another thing, and this is getting into the real nitty gritty of filmmaking here in the business side, is that Chabrol was very good at navigating essentially tax benefits and business contracts. So he was able to, one of the things we talk about a lot is the idea that these French films were shot with small crews. Well, technically, according to French filmmaking unions at the time, you weren't really allowed to have that small of a crew. You had to have certain people. If you were producing a film in France, you had to have certain people on set. But Chabrol was able to negotiate out certain crew positions that he didn't need for his film, and kind of set the template for other people, other French New Wave directors to forgo, scene designers or on-set sound technicians, because a lot of these films had like almost entirely ADR dialogue after the fact. And when he did that, not only did he make the French New Wave style of a small crew possible, but he also made shooting on a much smaller budget possible as well. And he was really good at navigating the government grant system. So he was able to get a lot of both grants and tax benefits for a lot of these productions, which again, I know sounds really boring, but it's so important to getting the French New Wave started that I have to mention it. So in a lot of ways, there's I've seen some quotes out there that mention Chabrol as the godfather of the French New Wave. And in a lot of the ways, he is like the facilitator that did the work to make all of this truly possible. Like the other guys had the drive to make their own movies, but he really stepped in to make it.
He went out there and broke some kneecaps.
Yeah. He got the money flowing. He got the resources available to everybody else, and of course he didn't do 100% of that. All of them had their own finances that were complicated. Truffaut, we talked about last week, his wife's father, his father-in-law, although I guess fiance-in-law for a little bit, was a big funder of his early work, and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to bring that up. And of course, his second film, Les Croisades, was both a reversal of Les Beau Serge and a solidification of Chabrol's style. It had the same actors, but swapped. And it featured the ambiguous motivations, the bourgeoisie, Hitchcock influences, and murder that would become signature hallmarks of Chabrol's style. And it would also establish the tradition or motif of Chabrol having characters named Paul and Charles in a lot of his movies. This was also his first film with Paul Gigolf, who was a French writer, producer, and actor, and would be an important co-writer and collaborator in Chabrol's career. After his early success, though, Chabrol produced a string of box office duds in the mid-'60s, and then in order to try to recover from those duds, he made more duds, including some really bad spy spoofs, all titled Les Tigres, or The Tiger. And those were even worse. And it was during that period of time, during the early period of time, he made the movie Les Bonnes Femmes, which we will be talking about today, which was not well received at the time, but was critically reevaluated later on. But the Les Tigres films were so bad that they tanked AJYM. And I believe he did some TV work to kind of dig himself out of that hole. But in the 70s, which is solidly in the post-New Wave era, Chabrol entered what some could call and do call his golden era, which was kicked off by the film Les Biquets, which I don't speak French, but I think it just means the bitches.
It doesn't, but I think that it's also not inaccurate.
It might be like a double entendre.
Yeah, I think I saw someone say what it means. It means I can't remember what it means, but it's not that, but also it's fitting for the movie.
Gotcha. But these films were all thrillers. Nearly all of them were thrillers, and very successful, if not as revolutionary as the New Wave era. And this is important to mention because this is kind of where Chabrol's career ended up. He would become a mainstream French film director of genre films. He made really good thrillers, and he was super prolific, the most prolific filmmaker out of the French New Wave by far. And I think the only person we've talked about, the only two people we've talked about who I think are on par are Spielberg and Hitchcock in terms of sheer output. And that's just people in the sound era. Some people earlier than that, like maybe John Ford, who has a more significant silent film career than Hitchcock, might outpace them. But Chabrol was at the pace of like one film a year for his whole career, from the debut of Les Beau Serge to his death in 2010. He averaged one film a year, which is crazy. That's a lot of work. But also he, despite his flailings in the late 60s, he did have a very successful career. But also that kind of fall off in the mid 60s, right when all of the other French New Wave directors were really hitting their stride, means that he's not really discussed as much as some of the other French New Wave directors. He kind of, while he was the big name early on, he was the guy who kicked it off. He was the guy who had helped everyone else get their stuff made. He wouldn't be the lasting name associated with the French New Wave. And today we're going to talk about why that's so sad, and why we should talk about him more. And obviously people who are into film academia and film history know about him, but you know, we're talking more about like the casual film buff. Go check out some Chabrol films, and here's why. But today we're speaking about three films in particular, Jonathan. And what are those films?
Well, those films are beginning with Le Beau Serge from 1958, directed by Claude Chabrol, written by Claude Chabrol, starring Gérard Blain, Jean-Claude Brialy, Michel Meritz, and Bernadette Lafont. Cinematography by Henri Dequet, and music by Émilie Delpierre. And we'll follow that up with Les Cousins from 1959, directed by Claude Chabrol, written by Claude Chabrol, again starring Jean-Claude Brialy and Gérard Blain, and Juliette Méniel. Cinematography by Henri Dequet again, and music by Paul Misraki. And finally, we'll be talking about Les Bonnes Femmes from 1960, directed by, you guessed it, Claude Chabrol, written by, Claude Chabrol, and starring Bernadette Lafont, Clotilde Joanna, Stéphanie Audran, and Lucille Saint-Simon. Cinematography by Henri Dequet, and music by Pierre Janssen and Paul Misraki.
All right, Jason, without further ado, take it away with Les Beau Serge.
Le Beau Serge from 1958. Francois returns to his small hometown after moving away long ago. His old friend, Serge, isn't who he used to be, now a depressed alcoholic married to a woman he got pregnant but doesn't love. Francois wants to find a way to help Serge, but after he falls for his friend's sister-in-law, whom also shares a history with Serge, the two men's friendship becomes more complicated than a simple reunion can heal.
I want to kick this off with a quote from The Films in My Life by Truffaut, where he talks about this film. It's a really short little snippet that he gives of it because, as I think you said in the introduction, this film was premiered outside of Cannes, but kind of alongside it. But he gives this really brief kind of overview, and he says, it's a chess game. This is just one part of it. He says, it's a chess game played by two young men. Gérard Blain has the black pieces and Jean-Claude Brialy the white. At the moment they meet, they change colors and the game ends in a tie. Which is kind of just an overview, and he goes on to say that makes it sound more intellectual than it feels like when you're watching it. But I do think it's interesting knowing that this film is inspired a lot by Shadow of a Doubt by Hitchcock, because there's a similar kind of a chess game dynamic in that film, even though when you look at Le Beau Serge and Shadow of a Doubt side by side, they're very different because one of the things that I think we're going to get into is Chabrol is pretty much always through and through a thriller director, but his films are not always thrillers. So it's interesting to see how he brings the feeling of a thriller to subject material that's more kind of run-of-the-mill dramatic.
Yeah. And that's that's one of the interesting things about his films. One of the criticisms I've seen of his films is that the themes aren't as lofty or intellectual as some of the other French New Wave directors. But I don't think that's a bad thing.
I also don't completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think he gets to those themes, but it's not all about those themes. I think his main drive as a director is tension.
Yeah.
But maybe even more so is his drive towards character. His character arcs are phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that tends to be where all the focus is. And trying to, because you don't really know where these people will end up by the end of the film. You can tell that that all those characters tend to be in moments of transition, but you don't know where they're transitioning to. And a lot of the tension derives from the way they interact with one another to influence those paths in unexpected ways. And often in very impactful ways, because all of the character decisions and character arcs that happen in Chabrol films, and Le Beau Serge is a good example of it, have high stakes. Even if they're deeply personal, non-flashy stakes, they're deeply held personal stakes, like Serge's drive to find a reason to live and not drink himself to death, which is hit and miss in terms of its existence over the course of the film, is interesting.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that, one of the things that struck me about this film is, and again, talking about how one of the real driving impetuses for the French New Wave is, like we explained last time, to make an extremely personal film, a film with very personal themes before the age of 35. And I think Chabrol was like 27 when he made this movie. He was very young, and yet the film is very mature. And I think that you see how personal the film is in the fact that it's set in his hometown, but also all of the characters are so multidimensional. They are all extremely flawed, and yet they all have some kind of moment where you can sympathize with them, or you're surprised by them. Like, they all have this duality. There's no just flat evil characters, and there's no just flat saint characters. They are all struggling with just trying to get through life, and a lot of them are struggling more than others, but there are two sides to every single character, not just the two main characters that we're following, but all the surrounding characters.
I mean, they're all. I'll agree that all the characters are complex, but there are some evil characters.
I mean, even the dad. Is that what you're talking about?
Oh yeah, the old dude who's not really her dad.
Yeah, but even he at the end has this moment of he's dying, and he tells the doctor to go deliver the baby, and he's like, my time is over. So he even has this selfless moment at the end that kind of redeems him. I mean, not fully, not justifies, but it gives his character more complexity.
Yeah, it does. It does give him more complexity. Yeah, for sure. And speaking of personal films, this is, well, I haven't seen, I don't believe it's autobiographical, but I do believe that it is in part autobiographical.
You can't make a film in your hometown and not hometown. Yeah, you can't just like skirt around that.
And like it's also like many of the other films in the French New Wave, focuses on using non-professional actors where possible. So like the baker in the town, who's one of the more saner characters, is actually just the real town baker. Who undoubtedly Claude Chabrol actually knew. So you'd have to think that at least some of the characters in some of these things are personally experienced by Claude Chabrol. And then in addition to that, one of the things that I think we see here is that Claude Chabrol himself is just a really good observer of human character.
Yeah.
And seeing the complexities in human actions, and not and because he wrote all of his movies too, being a really good writer in terms of fleshing out his characters, which is one of the hardest things to do when you write, is to make these characters feel real, and like they actually have a life outside of the bounds of the film itself, and that we're just seeing an interesting portion of it. But Chabrol does a really good job of that, in terms of making all these characters feel fleshed out and real and impactful. And then also, like you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, making them complex enough that we feel some degree of sympathy for all of them. And that everybody in this film, I think this is an important part that drives the tension, is trapped in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Like Serge is trapped in the marriage he doesn't want. His wife is trapped in the marriage she doesn't want. His sister-in-law is trapped living with an abusive guy who may or may not be her dad. And then even our main character it's heavily implied that he has tuberculosis.
Well, they actually
Or
say it. He doesn't confirm
recovering?
it. One of the guys, one of the side characters, when he first gets there, says, "Oh, you got a spot of TB, huh?" So it's like he has a minor case of TB that he's trying to recover from or something.
Yeah, in theory too. Like, this isn't like Doc Holliday in who famously had TB. That's why he was in Arizona. In American westerns, this is 1950s France. They have penicillin.
Yeah.
Presumably, he would be able to recover from it, but also, he is limited by it, and he is stuck here for the duration of his recovery at the very least.
But it's also becomes a really important dramatic point. I mean, that's part of what gives the climax its depth, right? Because the whole deal is that he ends up running all over the place to try and to help Serge's wife deliver the baby, and he has to go out one more time and find Serge in some hen house somewhere in town in the middle of winter, which is not good for his lungs. And they're like, you have to sit down or, you're basically going to sacrifice yourself. And so he literally does go out, sacrifice. And that illness in him is part of what makes that climax a sacrificial move on Francois's part.
I also like how heavily implied parts of the story are in Les Beau Serge. Like, we don't see what the friendship that Serge and Francois had before Francois left town. But through their actions afterwards, we experience the story of that friendship and how close it was. The way that when he confronts him in the bar the first time and tries to just say hello, Serge is so drunk that he doesn't even know who he is or where he is, and he just starts crying when he hears his friend's name. Or the fact that Francois is willing to go out in the snow and sacrifice his health to get his friend really they were more than just schoolmates. They were very close friends for sure. But also, because of how distant they are at the beginning and how changed they are, you can tell how broken off and disconnected that friendship is at the beginning of the story. So, and that this definitely isn't the only instance of it either, where you see where Chabrol does writing outside the confines of his story to kind of give his characters essentially their own lore, which everybody has.
I mean, when you put it like that, it really is a great example of doing exposition, because what he does in this film is we know that they were friends, but we are delivered the exposition and the character development for Serge at the same time. So we see, based on Serge's mental state, his reaction to Francois changes. And so as we kind of learn that they had this really close friendship, so he's happy to see him, but then when he sobers up, he becomes ashamed to see him, and he becomes mad at himself for the wreck that he's become. And so you're seeing like this this tears of joy and then this coldness of this kind of self-protection, self-righteousness. And so you're building a backstory and you're building the current character of Serge at the same time. And it's done really well. And that goes into one of the things we've been talking about with the French New Wave, which is the fact that I think Chabrol has kind of thoroughly taken on the guise of the auteur in terms of the fact that he wrote the film, but also his crafting is so good. And again, like one of the things you'll find if you look at reviews of this film is that the film feels like it was made by someone 10, 15, 20 years older than him, both from its thematic content and also from its just technical crafting for a guy who just picked up his camera for the first time to make this movie.
The obsession with Hitchcock really shows in how well planned out it is.
Yeah, there are some really great things. There's a point where Francois gets beat up by Serge in the snow, and then he goes back to his room and he like puts his head on the door before he walks in, and then there's this really long crossfade of this blustery snow that's swirling around his head as we move to the next scene. That's just a really great rhetorical kind of a device. And there's also there's a shot, and this is something that's interesting too, because Chabrol is so often associated with Hitchcock, but I just found a quote where he responded to that and said that 3 of his major influences were directors who weren't even Hitchcock, but we're going to see influence from all 3 of these directors in his work. So he says that his 3 biggest influences in his work were Murnau, Lubitsch, and Fritz Lang.
We're gonna see, that makes sense.
We're going to see Lubitsch a lot. We'll talk about him in a second.
Yeah, we'll say Lubitsch and late cousins for sure.
But talking about Murnau, there's a shot where Francois leaves after he leaves the old man and his stepdaughter or whatever for the last time, and there's this conflicting emotion within Francois of like, okay, so, and again, there's gonna be so many spoilers in this episode, so just heads up. So he leaves them, and he's like, because she went back to her quote unquote father even after he had violated her, but it's just, that's who she lives with. It's like, that's just part of life here in this town. And as he leaves, you see the door closes and it first hides the old man and the daughter. And then it shows 2 lamps on a table, a tall lamp and a short lamp. And I immediately thought of Destiny by Murnau, where you go into the hall of all the candles, which are all human lives, and the tall candles are the lives with more life to live, and the short candles are the ones that are almost blown out. And it felt like that kind of a mystical image that he was alluding to in that moment. So it's just like, again, the crafting in these films is so deep and precise.
He really thinks through each one. There's and it's an interesting contrast because, especially coming off of Truffaut, who kind of seems to go very strongly off of instinct.
Yeah.
And even Godard, who goes more off of like a certain intellectualism. Chabrol is like the craftsman. Like he knows his craft really well. And you know what? It takes me back to my the playwriting class I took in college. And one of the things my professor told me in that class was that every line of dialogue, to be well written and to be efficient, should both advance plot and build character. And to extrapolate that to film, where I would argue that dialogue is less important than shot grammar and what you're speaking with your shots. I feel like Chabrol's films very much fall into the category of having every shot both advance plot and build character. And when you're doing that every single time, every single shot, it makes a really good movie and it makes it really engaging.
And what you get on top of that, and maybe it's even as a result of that, is you get really good theming. So what I was finding while going through this is I kind of love the order that we're going in, which was not planned out because we're learning about these guys as we go. But I feel like Chabrol is a really great mix of the let's see, how did I put it in here? The moral meditations of Eric Romer, because there's a lot of pontification in Le Beau Serge, and also the kind of dramatic, sensational sensibilities of Truffaut, who loved to incorporate a lot of plot and things moving along. That was less apparent in Romer, but Chabrol kind of brings the two together, where I felt like sometimes Truffaut just had a lot of plot and it would muddy things sometimes. Here, I feel like you've got a lot of really complex moral dilemmas that are being resolved through plot rather than through dialogue.
Yeah, you know what? Chabrol's stories never span too much ground, but they go really deep on the ground they're in, which makes them really interesting.
That's a good point. I watched one extra film, but all four of the ones that I watched for this, they either take place within like a couple of blocks in a little town, or in the next one is almost entirely in one apartment. Yeah.
Like Les Cousins is almost 100% a stage play. It's almost a bottle film, but that which also plays into the theme of the film, and again, kind of trapping his characters into a scenario where their worlds have collided and they need their fundamental differences as people collide in that character-driven way.
Again, the black pieces and the white pieces.
But yeah, do you want to move on to Les Cousins from 1959? I feel like we should talk about that one now, because it's a stepping up of Les Beau Serge.
I know. So the last thing I do want to mention about Les Beau Serge, in terms of the fact that it's not really a thriller, but it has kind of a thriller heart, is that I feel like this film is a precursor to an American New Wave film. Did you have this same thought?
Yeah,
Which one?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Did you think of any specific one?
I was mostly thinking of Nicholas Ray movies, but I don't know if you'd count those as American New Wave.
Okay, well, I was thinking specifically of Chinatown, which hits a lot of very similar notes to this one. But that one is specifically a thriller film.
Yes, that is a thriller film. I was thinking of Rebel Without a Cause, which isn't really American New Wave. No, but the big studio.
The Cahiers guys love Nicholas Ray. They talk about him a lot.
Yeah, Nicholas Ray is so themey and also so critical of society as a whole, even though he operates within the mainstream of American cinema and Hollywood. So I could totally see that. And he also has really complex characters. Yeah. Everything's very character driven. And even within I think one of the reasons why Rebel Without a Cause popped up for me was kind of the same deal of it's so deeply personal. It's very character driven. It's really contained in terms of number of characters and the distances they travel, and just the everything's limited to the scope of the character's world in a really appreciative, in a really character driven way, in the same way that it happens in Les Beau Serge. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you that this one is. It's not technically a thriller because it's missing some of those genre components.
There's no mystery or crime or anything.
It's just so heavily driven. And I don't know, because of that, I would almost put it in the category of melodrama, but melodramas are just thrillers where nobody gets shot. So
what it is it's essentially tragedy. Especially if you're talking about it in terms of
a high tragedy.
Yeah, it's not necessarily that it has a tragic ending, but in kind of the Greek comedy versus tragedy sense, it's tragedy in that dramatic sense. And I think that we see that in a lot of Chabrol too. We're going to see it very much in Les Cousins.
Les Cousins has a super tragic ending.
It's just so, and the fact that he puts Wagner over the whole thing, it's it's high tragedy in a little apartment. So let's move on.
Anyway, Jason, take it away. Les Cousins, go.
Les Cousins from 1959. The idealistic, innocent provincial, Charles, moves to Paris to attend law school alongside his cousin, the decadent and dissolute Paul. Both men share Paul's father's luxurious apartment, but take opposite approaches to school, love, and life. Charles falls for a questionable young woman named Florence, who soon leaves him for Paul, even moving into their shared apartment. When his worldview and ideals are shaken to their core, it's a roulette roll where Charles will end up.
Jonathan, the other day, somebody was telling me that no Chekhov play actually has a gun in it. So we should really be calling it a Chabrol's gun because of this movie.
That was my biggest takeaway is this is the hugest Chekhov's gun I have ever seen.
It's the best example. Like it is the best example.
So we've talked about Chekhov's gun before, but if you aren't familiar, the idea is a classic dramatic technique that Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright, proposed, where if you have a gun hanging on the wall in your set in the first act of your play, by the third act of the play, at the very latest, that gun must have been fired at some point. Again, to the point of your screenwriter teacher's point,
playwriter,
everything,
stage writing.
Yeah. So everything within the dialogue, but also the mise en scène, which is the whole, everything that's in the screen, on the stage, whatever, should be relevant to the story, the plot, the characters, the themes. And so this film has a gun that we see within like 10 minutes, and we see it multiple times, and it definitely finishes off the movie.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately in terms of design as a whole, and I think like craft as a whole when it comes to film, but also other things. One of the things I've gotten really into in the past couple of years has actually been like cars and car history, and I've been listening to a lot of car podcasts and about some of like the great like car builders and car designers and stuff. And a lot of the times the best at it are the ones who emphasize efficiency in their design, and they don't include like an inch of steel or a pane of glass on a car unless it serves a purpose, unless it provides a function for whatever that function may be, because that could be different. Like you could totally like streamline a car and lighten it completely for racing, but if you have a car that's for hauling kids around, you're going to optimize it differently, but still you're looking to add exactly the amount you need and you don't have extra there. And I like that idea because I keep seeing it pop up in other designs as well, whether it be building houses or designing rooms, and especially like we're talking about now, like how Chabrol designs his films. There's not stuff there unless it kind of needs to be there and serves a purpose. And he has such a tight control over everything in his films, which again, very Hitchcock.
Well, there's another principle that you kind of have to hold double-handed with that kind of efficiency principle, which is more a principle of beauty and aesthetic, which is the repeated design or the repeated pattern. So if you look at a cathedral, there are a lot of things that are extraneous, but the reason that it all adds to the beauty of the cathedral is that it's like the same arch is repeated in every corner, or the same flourish is added at each apex or whatever. And so there's a lot of that goes into storytelling too, in terms of the way that you repeat elements and also the way that you contrast those repeated elements. So one of the things to talk about with Les Cousins is that it is a film of foils. It is...
Oh gosh, it's the ultimate foil film.
It is contrasts everywhere.
You know what? Oh my gosh. You know what just popped into my head?
What?
I know we both read this in high school too. Do you remember the play for The Importance of Being Earnest?
I love The Importance of Being Earnest. Is this the dark, gritty version of The Importance of Being Earnest? This
is the dark, gritty reboot of The Importance of Being Earnest.
Oh my gosh. They are very foppish.
I think Earnest is literally about two cousins too, isn't it?
Were they related? I think they were related. That is a masterfully designed story.
But yeah, it's also a story of of two kind of foils in a very similar way that cross paths, but they also have their own, end up with their own love interests. Whereas in this one, it becomes a very tragic and messed up love triangle.
It's
Just,
so
I
French.
mean, oh my gosh. Yeah. Movies like this really make me wonder if the French are okay. But not as much as
We've
not
had
as
so
much
many
as,
love triangles. Like the stereotype of French just being like love triangles everywhere. We are not dispelling that with this series at all.
No. Oh my gosh, the French do it to themselves. What the heck, guys? And of course, I guess this is a while ago. Everything's from the 60s here, or the 50s. So, things could have changed, but the mid-century French had some issues, it seems, if we're going off these films. But yeah, just imagine how utterly like horrible and awkward it would be to have your cousin and roommate like straight up, like not even kind of gray area, just straight up steal your love interest, and then have your love interest move into the same apartment that you both live in.
You know what it is though?
Oh my God.
which I've realized with several of these, like especially some of the early moral tales, is that these films are just, you could transpose them into American college dorm life and keep the story exactly the same.
That's a really good point.
That's all it is.
Considering all of the people who made these films are, especially in the French New Wave, are college. They are either college dropouts. Some of them finished their degrees. Chabrol did finish his, but they're all relatively young, under 35, and connected to that. They're educated. They're relatively affluent, at least bourgeois for the time. So that's a good point. That's probably skewing a lot of this experience that we're seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, you should not. I mean, the girl is 20, which is ridiculous in the film, and the guys are probably not that much older. But yeah, you just have the most awkward scenes of like the guy, our main guy, which the two actors kind of switch their role and which one is buttoned up
roles.
and which one is loose and carefree. But he's trying to study for his big test, and they're just like taking a shower with this little like fuzzy glass wall between them, and they're like laughing and having a great time, and he's like, I'm trying to study my law book, guys.
Gosh, yeah. Oh my gosh. But also, yeah, this one has a really big Lubitsch influence in it too.
Yeah.
Because a good portion of the film does play as comedy. It has a lighthearted kind of almost cosmopolitan, that college campus vibe that also fits really well with a lot of Lubitsch's work.
But what Chabrol does is he's able to do this thing where all the characters are kind of laughing things off like it's comedy, but there's a tension underneath it, whether it's like the one uptight guy, like our main character, or when he introduces the Wagner and then our other guy starts being all creepy and whatnot. But there's always this little sense of uneasiness, even in really mundane moments, that Chabrol never really lets you get too comfortable at any point in a lot of his movies.
Yeah, no. There's always tension. But also, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's always subtext to what people are saying, which is another good hallmark of good dialogue. Yeah. Characters talking about one thing when they're really talking about something else.
Yeah. And there's a really interesting element of there's a lot of times that I've realized in Chabrol's films where he's leading you to he's like the Occam's razor of filmmakers. It's like he's leading you to the most obvious answer, but the whole time you're asking yourself, is it really that obvious, or is he gonna pull a trick on me at some point? So you have things where like the bookkeeper keeps giving us this false sense of hope for our main character. Like we keep rooting for him more and more until we realize, oh, that's not how the world works sometimes. Nope.
I will say this too about all Chabrol endings, but I think this one's a very good example of it. It fits the criteria that we've set out on this podcast for a really good ending for a movie, which is something surprising, but that also makes sense.
Yeah.
And that kind of, again, plays into the Chabrol's gun aspect of the whole thing.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to bring up here, because I think it's a theme that overshadows all of Chabrol's work, which is really interesting. And I don't know what to make of it or why Chabrol was so fascinated in this. But in every single film that we're talking about, and the one I watched, The Butcher also, and this also applies to The Butcher, there's the underlying theme is this contrast between this kind of this carnal, almost like savage nature that's beneath this the put together facade that quote unquote civilized people have. So you see in Le Beau Serge, there's this kind of, you get the sense that Francois is observing this almost animalistic culture where they're like all sleeping with each other, they're getting into fights, just getting drunk, where they have no control over their impulses. And like Cousins is the same thing. You have the guy who's like so contained within himself, doing like just studying and keeping everything in line. And then you have the other guy who just gives in to any and every impulse and whim. And we're going to see that in Le Bon Femme as well. But it's just this kind of balance between civility and savagery or barbarism to some extent.
It's like that's Chabrol's opinion on humanity.
Right. And he can use it to make a dramatic situation out of anything.
Yeah. And make really good characters. Maybe that's why his characters are just so darn relatable, because they all contain the two sides of what it is to be human. Yeah.
It's like Hitchcock always has kind of the same theme of, Truffaut summed it up really well, but there's like this grasping for something that's been lost that you can't really get back to without losing yourself.
Yeah, I could see that. I would also say that this one is a thriller. I think this one goes beyond just having thriller elements and thriller influences.
The Chekhov's gun helps.
A thriller because the gun goes off.
Yeah. Because the gun is there, regardless of whether it goes off.
Yeah. I love the way the gun goes off at the end. It's so tragic and no one's happy about it.
Yeah.
Like it's just a complete tragic accident, but also is it really like because the one cousin kind of drove the other cousin crazy over the course of the film? And there's an argument to be made that both cousins drove the one cousin crazy. Is that just like the physical expression at the end, the firing of the gun, of what the hedonistic cousin did unintentionally to the other cousin's sanity over the course of the movie?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point about the themes. Like it always comes to the ultimate apex of whatever Chabrol's been building to. That's kind of my takeaway from Le Bon Femme too. But it's like, the farther you go, at some point you get to the end. And the end of this one is the gun going off. That's as far as you can take it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, in terms of the foils, I realized there's a really subtle one with the Philippe guy from the very beginning, who is just so distraught that the one hot girl won't go out with him anymore or dumped him for this other guy. And at first you think that he's really pathetic, and our main character, Charles, thinks that he's really pathetic. And then Charles becomes him by the end of the film. And because I think Philippe like jumps off a bridge or off a ledge or something and breaks his legs. And so it's like he's the foreshadowing for where Charles is headed, because he's so, even though all of his actions say that he's moving on from this girl, the ending says that he didn't.
Yeah, he definitely didn't. It's excellent foreshadowing, an excellent use of a side character, and a good example of kind of just hubris of the sheer way someone could think, oh, that person's pathetic. I would never fall for that trap.
Yeah.
But everybody thinks that about everything until they fall for the trap.
Yeah. And also, I love the moment. Again, the crafting is so good. We can pull up so many like little moments, but I love the moment where Paul sends Florence in to check on Charles while he's studying, while they're having their party, and he plays Die Valkyrie is playing, or the Ride of the Valkyries, and so she's like walking towards him to like try and tempt him while this song that's about the Nikes or the Valkyries, the angels coming down from heaven to interfere in the lives of men. It's like the Wagner theme is so. I mean, I'm sure there's way more because the Der Ring ist der Nibelungen is such a dense, like tragic, dramatic material that I'm sure every single moment that it comes up in this film is super impactful. But he just is drenching this film in melodrama by using that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He, again, and we've seen this with all the French New Wave directors, but their referencing skills are on point. Their ability to pull from a wide variety of knowledge, which again kind of plays into the Lubitsch idea of being able to reference like a cosmopolitan set of various slices of Europe's culture over the past few hundred years, and kind of just like this academic set of people as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But yes, anything else to say about Les Cousins before we move on to Les Bonnes Femmes?
No, let's do it.
Oui, allons-y, Jason.
Les Bonnes Femmes from 1960. 4 young women live in Paris and work at the same appliance store. Each encounters Parisian men, ranging from fun to evil. Jane is happy-go-lucky. Jeanette moonlights as an entertainer. Rita's fiancé doesn't respect her or even seem to like her as a person. And Jacqueline is being followed by a man who is either in love with her, wants to kill her, or possibly both.
The title translates a couple of different ways. I think literally it's just the good girls, although I've seen a couple times it's translated as the good time girls, like the girls who like to have a good time.
As well, yes. Yeah. I feel like Good Time Girls might be a better title. But I guess a lot of it depends on how that term Les Bonnes Femmes would be used contextually within. Yeah.
Although I will say
within
that
French language.
In French, to say, like have a good time, you say passe un bon temps. So bon temps, which is good time, sounds like bonne femme. So it might be a play on words.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying le bon temps femme.
Yeah, and that would just sound silly.
I kind of like it, actually.
Unlike the rest of French.
Okay, so Alex, I have seen at least some Letterboxd user describe this as, what did they say? Something like there's a thriller lurking in the background of the movie. And there kind of is, but I feel like we're going to have to talk about the thriller aspect. So there's big spoilers, which just saying that there's spoilers in this film is itself too much of a spoiler. But I think that the thriller is integral to the rest of it. It's not like this separate thing that just happens at the end. It is, the culmination of what we have been seeing transpire throughout the first 3/4 of the film.
Yes, yeah, very much so. It is, it's all connected, all of the, essentially, right, because you have, the way the movie's set out is that you have these 4 women that are all living in Paris. Most of them work at the same place.
Very shop around the corner.
Very shop around the corner-esque. But instead, we don't really focus on their life inside the store, except for once or twice. We mostly focus on their lives outside of the store, and they each kind of suffer both from their own virtues and vices as characters, but also the way the world interacts with them at the same time. And one of them definitely, and one of the girls, basically the thriller aspect that we're talking about, has a dude who's just a straight up stalker.
Yeah.
And like clearly a psycho when she starts interacting with him. But she seems to really enjoy it and find him hilarious and entertaining. And by the end of the movie, he's killed her. So it's...
But also, it almost implies that she wanted it to happen that way.
Yeah, it's very strange. Like, it's very much has the vibe of her succumbing to a demon.
So here's what I was thinking. Like, back when we talked about Ugetsu, and we were talking about how the ghost story is just a physical manifestation of the themes, where he goes to try and make his profit and leave his family in wartime, and by doing so, he's courting death. And so the ghost story of him literally being courted by a ghost is just the natural outflowing of what he's doing in kind of a metaphysical way in the rest of the more grounded parts of the story. And so I think here, it's like each of the girls is giving themselves over to a destructive force. And by the end, we bring that to its natural conclusion. So whether it's one of them is just going out and having flings with guys that pick her up on the side of the road, or one of them is staying in a relationship where the guy doesn't respect her, or one of them is staying at a job that she hates and is trying to do her art on the side and stressing her out. But by the end, it's like this one girl is just giving herself over. She basically knows that he's a serial killer, and she's kind of okay with it. Like, there are several points, and again, this is where Chabrol he sets it up so much that you're like, but is he really? Like, are you going to do something that obvious? Because you have the moment where she's like staring at the man-eating tiger and smiling, and then he has this stupid smile on his face. Or she literally gets blessed by the bloody rag of a man who was killed for murdering women. And so you're just setting it up, and you're still by the end,
is that a blessing or a curse, really?
Depends on. She seemed pretty happy about it.
You know what? So I've heard this saying before that everybody is their own worst enemy.
Yeah.
We don't know how to get out of our own way, and oftentimes the one who's probably causing the most grief in our life tends to be ourselves. And this movie kind of plays out like a slowly escalating recursion of that theme, where each of the girls is kind of getting in their own way. And certainly, like, you know, the people around them are awful. Like, clearly there's no excuse for murder. And that one woman's
I love when we have to say stuff like that.
But also, like, from a thematic, like, storytelling perspective, at the same time, like, you're kind of being an asshole to yourself by engaging with these people in the first place.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, by the end of the
respect
film,
yourself more. Leave, please.
By the end of the film, the D-bags who keep following them and trying to seduce them just for kicks and giggles, they don't seem so bad by the end. It's like, rather be stalked by these doofuses who just want to hook up with girls every night than someone who's literally going to kill you.
Yeah, at least you don't get murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it definitely has that vibe. But it has the Chabrol, like, it has all the Chabrol's techniques in there, the control of mise-en-scene, the reoccurring themes, and images and characters and occurrences. It has the tension building. I think the big difference, and why this one might not have been as successful as his other films upon its initial release, is that is actually the vignette style. I think it's...
You don't think it was the downer ending?
Well, yeah, to an extent, but, you know, Les Cousins also has a very downer.
But you're waiting for it in Les Cousins. I feel like Les Bonnes Femmes just kind of smacks you in the face at the end.
It does, and I think it smacks you in the face because of the vignette style.
Yeah.
Because it's, and we mentioned this with Les Beau Serge, but Chabrol does very well when stuff goes very in depth with very few characters. Les Bonnes Femmes is more spread out than his other films because of the vignette style and the scope he's trying to cover in that. And essentially, like, because it's a vignette, right? He's telling like 4 stories that are connected instead of one story. So it doesn't have the time to really develop that same connection, which is a shame because each of the characters clearly have the same seem to have the same quality of build to them that the characters in Les Beau Serge and Les Cousins do. We just don't get the same time with them and the same. But
really, yeah, and I think the deal is that, you know, it's a mosaic of the theme, right? The theme is the main character. So it's not about any one girl in particular. It's about how they're all destroying their lives in various ways.
And I think that's why it is a good film. But I also think that's why it took a while for that critical reevaluation to hit, and why it didn't hit as successfully right off the bat. Another similar film that we've already talked about in the series is actually Godard's Verve sa vie. But during that film, even though it is technically a series of vignettes, it all sticks with one woman.
Yeah,
and
it's
even
a progressive mosaic of a theme revolved around one character.
Yeah. Vignettes are so interesting and can make really interesting movies, but it's also I don't think it connects as well to the audience as viscerally.
It's hard to pull off unless you make each vignette a really tight, really dense, like short story type of build, which short stories can take as long to develop as a full length story. And so it's hard to put 4 of them into one film and have them all be as dense as they need to be.
Yeah.
What do you think about the very, very end where basically, I don't even think we see the guy. We just see this girl in this dance hall and she's sitting down and the camera moves towards her and she looks at the camera and then starts dancing and we only see the guy from behind, but it's like we become implicit in the stalking and the preying on the next girl.
Yeah, it's kind of has that vibe of, oh, here we go again. There is something about the film as a whole that feels cyclical in a sense. And beyond just one of the characters being a serial killer. But
they don't even say that he's a serial killer, but you just kind of assume
that. Know. That guy's a serial killer.
Yeah.
That's Chekhov's serial killer right there. But yeah, there is something kind of cyclical. Like a lot of the stories you see here collected together are kind of things that you could consider tales as old as time. Like the woman whose fiance does not respect her in the least. In a lot of ways, a lot of things we see are everyday tragedies that you see played out over and over and over again. But people keep falling for them. People keep getting stuck in paths. Or having bad actors act on them, which also kind of makes the ending even more of a downer, right? Because it feels inescapable in a sense. Like, oh, it's just going to continue. And even if this guy gets caught, like, you know, like the guy whose bloody rag was used to bless the one girl, right? Like that was a serial killer. He's dead. But there's another one.
There will always be another.
There's another one. Like, so in a sense, like if you look at it from that angle, the ending's really depressing.
Yeah. Also, question. Is this, I haven't actually confirmed if it does, but this might be the only film we've talked about from the French New Wave so far that passes the Bechdel test.
I'm sure it is.
So we've talked about this a long time ago too.
I would be shocked if it's not.
We've talked about this a long time ago too, but the Bechdel test is a just kind of a measurement of how well developed your female characters are. If in your film there are 2 female characters that have any conversation that is not about a man. And I'm pretty sure
a low bar.
It's a low bar, but surprisingly, very, very, very few films actually pass that test.
Not a lot of few films actually hit that mark, though.
And it's a surprising thing because you want to say, well, how many films is there like a man version of that? But you can immediately think of like 100 where they're just talking about guns or cars or whatever and not talking about women. But it's so much harder to think of films where female characters are talking about things other than men, and especially
A lot.
I will say, in the French New Wave, these are very personal films written by men usually about their own kind of love lives and stuff like that. But this one actually has enough female characters and enough scenes of them in the little shop that I think it's the only one that passes.
Well, that's what I was about to say. Like most of the time, especially with older films, they fail the Bechdel test by default by not having more than one female character.
Right.
Or
which
sometimes
usually in these
not
love
even
triangles,
any female characters with a speaking role.
Yeah, and there's usually in these love triangles one woman. So
Yeah.
these French New Wave films have been difficult too.
Yeah.
Maybe Day for Night. Day for Night might have passed, but I can't remember for sure.
I bet Day for Night does pass, actually, now that I think about it. There must have been a conversation between the diva and her assistant that passes the Bechdel test. There must have been. But yeah, there also is like, and part of it's just because it's the 1950s and 1960s, but there is some level of misogyny in all of these movies that is either dismissive or downright disrespectful towards female characters.
Well, in this film, it's like calling out misogyny.
Yeah, that's that was the point that I was getting to after I watched the movie. I was like, wow, that's a scathing indictment of how French society and Parisian society thinks of women, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like kind of just dispose. That's why I like Good Time Girls as a title, because it kind of conjures this idea, like those guys that you see over the course of the movie who are just trolling for women. They just view women as somebody, or maybe even something to just have a good time with, and then you don't have to worry about them as a person outside of that.
Even the shop owner was so creepy.
Yes. Yeah. No. All of the. I can't. I'm trying to think if there might be an exception in this movie, but pretty much all of the men in this film are.
I think they're all terrible.
Very creepy, very terrible, and very dismissive and disrespectful and straight up hateful or murderous towards women. And part of it was like, kind of like, feels like a representation of like a Parisian woman's experience of misogyny in the 1960s. Is like, oh, this must have sucked.
Yeah. But again, there's blame on both sides because they're not protecting themselves very well just in the way that they're living their lives. But and then there's also the theme that I was saying is running through a lot of these films of the kind of barbarous aspect of humanity, and you see that starkly in the scene where they go to the zoo, and the women start screaming and howling and laughing while they're looking at the monkey cages, and the monkeys are sitting there quietly, like, are y'all really this wild? Like the women are being more primeval than the apes are in that moment.
Yeah, that was a weird moment where I was like, "Oh, are you guys are a little unhinged, aren't you?" But also it was weird because there are moments in the movie, like especially at the start of the movie, I think, and towards the end of the movie as well, where there's kind of like all of the women just have this very blank, blasé look on their face. And ironically, in that moment, it was kind of a role reversal, where instead of being the ones with blank, blasé looks on their faces, while the men make monkey noises at them, basically, it's the monkeys being calm in their cage at the zoo, while the women make monkey noises at them. Yeah. Kind of an interesting role reversal.
Yeah. Again, Chabrol does a pretty good job of adding complexity to all of the characters in his films.
Yeah. They're all interesting characters. I feel like I would either want one or two things, either to push the film in either one of two directions, either to focus on one or two women and really go in depth with them, or make the vignettes even smaller and have more women's experiences spread out. That'd be my one wish for the movie. Yeah. But also, I don't know if either of those would have worked as well as the original Les Bonnes Femmes. And like we mentioned, even though the original critical reception of this film was not super positive, and this did kind of kick off that downward spiral that booted Chabrol out of the public zeitgeist when it came to the French New Wave. This has been critically reevaluated, and like we're talking about today, it's a really interesting, fascinating, well-made film that has a lot to say about 1960s France, and is a very French New Wave film in the sense, at the very least, that this is not something you would have seen in a mainstream French movie prior to 1960 at all. And is shot in Chabrol's classic small, intimate style that he shoots most of his films in, with the help of Henri Dessau.
Yeah, even though the locations are more spread out, it still feels like a very tight film. Like we were talking about with Vivre sa vie, where even though we go to a lot of places, the surroundings are almost always cropped out by these close shots that just focus on the main character, the main action that we're focusing on.
Yeah. And like we mentioned with the other two films, all of the characters kind of feel trapped within their lives and the virtues and vices of their characters as well. And kind of that inescapable cycle that we've mentioned.
Yeah.
All right, Jonathan, anything else to say about Les Bonnes Femmes, or shall we slide into overall notes?
All right, yeah, let's do overall.
Oui. So what do we think about Chabrol in terms of like where he fits into the French New Wave, Jonathan? What's your impression of him? I know neither of us really have experiences with his films prior to this episode.
Yeah, and I feel like Chabrol might be the best place to start for the French New Wave, because he does such a good job of capturing the classic technical mastery of Golden Age American Hollywood films and the sensibilities and thematic development of the French New Wave, adding that personal element, making a film that is about something that matters to you. And I think he does a really good job of bridging those two things. So if you're familiar with Hitchcock's work or Wells's work or Huston's work, you're going to be familiar in the style and the feel of Chabrol films while getting into the headspace of the French filmmakers. And then you can move on to a Truffaut, a Romer, a Godard, or something like that.
Yeah, he's a very good bridge to the other directors in the sense that like he's got character-driven work, and Romer has character-driven work. Of course, Chabrol's characters are very dirty, messy, and complex, and Romer's are much more literary, although still complex.
Yeah, they have clean hands and dirty minds.
Yes, that's a very good way to sum up Romer's characters. Yeah, but yeah, he's got the genre influences that Truffaut has. He's got a lot of the interesting small shooting techniques and topic coverage that Godard has. Although, of course, Godard goes off on his own Don Quixote quest over the course of the French New Wave. So it's kind of hard to say anything's a true bridge to Godard other than Godard. But yeah, it makes Chabrol very accessible, I think. And I think that's a good point over to his overall career, is that he just ended up being a mainstream director, like a very successful, monetarily successful, critically successful, with a steady career French mainstream director, which seems to have been his goal from the outset, and he did it. He helped his fellow Cahiers crew get started, and you know what? He did have the trouble in the 60s, which I think really is the reason we don't hear about him in the same breath as Godard and Truffaut.
Which is also characteristic of mainstream directors.
Which is also characteristic of mainstream directors, yeah.
There's always a slump somewhere.
Yeah, but in a lot of ways, I would say he had a more successful career than either of those guys.
Yeah.
He was much more consistent than Godard. And Godard would spend most of his time making essentially political propaganda pieces for his casus belli of the moment for most of his career, and then get into a fight with everybody he ever knew. Are
you saying Godard is the Orson Welles of France?
A little bit. Although also Orson Welles is the Orson Welles of France. So
Orson Welles is the Orson Welles of the world.
It's true. The dude's everywhere. or was everywhere. And then Truffaut had a very good career as well, but obviously he had a much more combative career in a lot of ways than Chabrol. He really wanted to take down the mainstream, and unfortunately his career did end, was cut short because of his illness. So I think in a lot of ways Chabrol kind of achieved what a lot of the other French New Wave directors might have wanted to achieve, and he has the longest career out of any of them. The closest out of the ones we've talked about so far is probably Romer.
I feel like he's also the most
prolific as well.
I think, and again, we haven't watched too much of his oeuvre because again, it's huge. But I think he's probably the most consistent in terms of sticking with a genre and just kind of infusing that thriller kind of undertones into everything that he did.
Oh yeah,
but
yeah.
Again, that's part of his style, and it's even he has in some of his writings in Cahiers du Cinéma that you can read. Some of it's been translated into English. He talks about how he has a whole piece on the evolution of the thriller, and he basically says, even though the thriller was a pretty stock genre in America, and none of the Cahiers guys are down on genres in America. They actually love the idea of genre.
Like genre.
Truffaut says all American genres are noble. So the Western is a noble genre. The thriller is a noble genre. And there's ways to do it. But Chabrol was really big about how the writers would find ways within the studio system, within the genre, to infuse their own, the more they were able to infuse their own personal aspect, their own personal take of a story into it, the better that the genre just became kind of a dressing on a theme and on storytelling in general, which again is part of what the whole French New Wave is about. It's about making films more personal and fighting against, again, Truffaut's made-to-order films. You can make a film made to order, but you have to take it and make it your own to some extent for it to really have some kind of intrinsic value.
Yeah. That's almost always been the story of art in Western culture too. Like some of the great paintings were commissions for churches and lords, but they were good when the painter was able to infuse their own personality into it as well. Shakespeare made plays for the masses, but he was able to infuse art into it as well to achieve something more. You know, Hitchcock was making essentially line genre pieces when he first got to America, but he made them so well and so personally and so uniquely with his own themes and skills that people loved them so much that he was able to become a self-driven auteur in the later portion of his career. And the French New Wave guys definitely identified that and went ham with it.
Yeah, Chabrol ends his piece on the thriller. The last line, he says, "Now, if you're a reasonable person, you might say, but all the themes have been done for thrillers. Like, we've done them all already." And he's like, as if a theme isn't what an auteur makes of it. It's like you can take the same theme and do it a bunch of times, but if it's personal and if it matters and if you're looking at it from a new perspective, it's going to be a new and good and useful film.
Yeah. And he certainly had the skills with his control of mise en scène and other techniques to make his films palpably tense. Every shot built character, every shot drove the plot. We cared deeply about the characters. They're well fleshed out, both with their motivations and subtext on screen and their implied actions off screen, which, and as we talked about before, implications always a good way to drive audience involvement and engagement with your piece, which is key to making it a good piece in the first place. But yeah. I, for one, am actually very excited to go check out some of his golden era thriller films, like Les Biches, or however you say that.
You should watch The Butcher, too. I'd be interested in your take on it.
Is that from his early period or his later period?
That's 1970, right on that 70 line.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'd be interested to check that out. I might, for the heck of it, try one of his spy spoofs, but they don't sound great. So I probably won't watch a lot of his Le Tigre series.
I'm interested in the Blue Panther because I think it's like
he made something called the Blue Panther.
Yeah, I think it's like a proto Bond.
Well, it's interesting too because the 60s is kind of when the Pink Panther started as well. So that's strange.
Yeah, it's listed at the beginning of Truffaut's book on Hitchcock. He has a list of films that are heavily inspired by Hitchcock, and Les Cousins is on there, and the Blue Panther is on there. So I've been interested in the Blue Panther for a while.
Interesting. But yes, I think we both really like Chabrol. I think he's quickly becoming my favorite French New Wave director, which I didn't really have one before. I think Chabrol might be one of the ones whose films I just kind of connect with in that special way to make him.
They have a great balance of depth and ease of digestibility.
Yes, yeah. And they're always so deeply engaging. I don't need to drink espresso before them like I do with a Romer film, which are good movies, but you need to be prepared. I just want to throw it out there. It's the same thing as reading a book. So if that's not what you're expecting to do.
Especially if you don't speak French.
Especially if you don't speak French, which I think, as I've established clearly over the course of this series so far, I do not speak French. So there you have it. But we have one director left to talk about in the French New Wave series, Jonathan. So who are we talking about next time on the podcast?
We are talking about, speaking of Romer, we're talking about Romer's successor as editor to Cahiers du Cinéma, and a man who makes some of the longest movies of all time.
Oh my gosh, what the heck?
And,
what the heck, Jacques?
So we're not even talking about some of his longest films, but at least one of them is over 4 hours long. Anyway, we're talking about his breakout Paris nous appartient, Paris Belongs to Us from 1961.
What's his name, Jonathan?
Oh, yeah. His name is Jacques Rivette. That's very important. Jacques Rivette is our next director.
The last of the Cahiers crew, the quintuple of critics turned directors who are associated with the French New Wave. There technically are others. I want to throw that out there, but we're covering the 5 main.
Yeah. And Rivette is very influential. Like I said, he became one of the editors, so he also had lots of strong opinions. He wrote a lot, so we'll be digging into all that. But his breakout, Paris Belongs to Us from 1961, followed by L'Amour Fou, Crazy Love, I think, from 1969, and followed by Celine and Julie Go Boating from 1974. And he made films late into the 90s. I think Chabrol has some films into the 90s, too.
I believe it. Yeah, Chabrol made movies up until not long before his death in 2010.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, that will wrap up our series next time.
You know what? We should also mention, too, that Paris nous appartient, or Paris Belongs to Us, was actually funded by AJYM, Chabrol's production company, which I think we might have mentioned, but I just want to throw that out there before we moved on.
And we'll bring it up again next time.
Yeah, before we end discussion on Chabrol for the day. But that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 492 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us at The Filmlings.
Summaries for this week's episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover everything I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. And this is episode 160, Cahiers du Cinéma Part 3. Is that right? No, this is Part 4, right? We've already done 3 directors.
Yeah, Part 4.
All right, take 2.
Man, who that up in the outline, I wonder.
61 also. All right. Also, you, I think you put in the, just for the name of the folder, Charles Chabrol. So
I did. Okay. I was like, I realized like partway through prepping the podcast that I've been typing Charles instead of Claude. And I was like, where did that come from? And then I went back to go fix them. And I was like, I knew I forgot one location of it and the folder. That was it. Okay.
Yeah. I feel like you might have said it at the end of the last podcast. I
might have said it at the end of the last podcast too. I don't know. There's CHs and Cs and I don't know. It's not alliterative, but there is a word for when things start with the same multiple words in a row start with the same
like consonantive
letter, consonant, but consonantive. Yeah, but not the same sound.
Yeah. All right, I think we've figured out what we're talking about. Let's just go from the top.